listener production.
Hey, it's Antoinette Lattouf with the Weekend Briefing. So you're probably used to listening to me chat with comedians, actors, activists, chefs, and even sports stars. But my guest today is none of those things. He's the 30th Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison. Since losing office and his several secret ministries, he's written a book. It's about his faith and what it has taught him and what it can teach you. You'll hear a lot about ScoMo spirituality. You'll also hear me asking questions he probably didn't love having to answer about repenting, about his sins, and about his impact on Australians. And somehow, we even got to talking about Oprah. Mr. Morrison, welcome to the briefing. I want to start off by asking, are there days when you wake up and you're like, oh, I'm so glad I'm not Prime Minister anymore?
Yeah, there's quite a few of those, particularly when you see what's going on. The world's not getting any less complicated, I should say. And the challenges are still there that I was dealing with when I was Prime Minister. It was a great privilege and the highlight of my professional life to be able to have had that role. But, it's a tough gig. It's a very tough gig. And whoever's in it. Anything
in particular, anything specific that makes you think, gee, I'm glad I'm not leading the country out of this one?
Well, the government's found itself and gotten itself into some economic difficulties, and the cost of living pressures are very high here in Australia. And at the last election, although I don't really get into domestic politics anymore, I had my go in that job, and not my job now to have a running commentary on those who followed me or my colleagues. But, it's not quite what they said it would be. So anyway, that's for them to sort out. They were the ones who said they could deal with it, and that's up to them. But I suppose the more global issues where I'm more involved these days, the threat of the People's Republic of China, the PSC, the communist government there, on our region is not abating. We've just seen that very recently, again, with the threatening behaviour against one of our military helicopters, and that followed the incident with the HMAS Toowoomba. They may change their tune, they may change their tactics, but their strategy and intent is the same. And frankly, I think they treat Australia with a lot of disrespect.
What you are here to talk about, if we're not going to chat too much about domestic politics or international politics, is your book. You've written a book, Plans for Your Good, a Prime Minister's testimony of God's faithfulness. And the thing most people are talking about is your openness about mental health and taking antidepressants. Why do you think this has resonated so much?
Well, I still think there's a bit of mystery that sits around these types of things. And, when I was Prime Minister, I did everything I could to try and destigmatise issues that related to mental health. Mental health is like physical health. And when I was Prime Minister, I had to take special care of my physical health. I also took blood pressure medication. That's a genetic thing, and I've had done that for a very long time and still do today. But you've got to be equally mindful about your mental health. And when I was in that job, it wasn't the challenges of the issues we were dealing with, the pandemic, the recession that followed that, and of course the many natural disasters. A bullying China was the toughest period we'd seen in Australia since the Second World War. Now, some of those issues have abated somewhat. Obviously, we're not in the pandemic anymore. But it was more the physical exhaustion of that. But then you combine that with what was a pretty intense political pile-on after the 2019 election, where those who were pretty unhappy about me winning that election decided to go very personal and, frankly, based campaigns on outright lies, the courts have found. And, that... We're not made of stone politicians. We're not complaining about it, but it's a pretty brutal business. And when you're subjected to that over a long period of time, it takes a toll.
And speaking about that pile-on and taking a toll, does it ever get easier, or do you ever get used to people loathing you or hating you or saying awful things about you?
Well, it sort of goes with the territory. If you want fair, don't go into politics. Again, it's not a complaint. It's just an acknowledgement of what the reality of it is. And you go into it with your eyes wide open. I think it's got a lot worse, though, from the time when I first went into politics, and I think that is fundamentally derived from the impact of social and digital media on politics and what it's meant for the media, what does drive stories these days, and what does put eyeballs on things. And that's changed the way I think media cover politics, and I think it's changed the way politicians engage with politics, and not for the better, I don't think.
Your book's been described less of a political memoir, which many former leaders have penned, and more pastoral encouragement. Was that your intention?
Absolutely. I had no interest in writing a political memoir. History will be its own judge of these things, and I'm pleased with what I was able to do when I was office, and confident about the contribution that it's made. I didn't waste a day when I was in office, and don't really feel the need to go around sort of protesting it or defending it. What I felt the need to do is give acknowledgement to what God has done in my life and the impact he's had on me, and to encourage others to think about faith, to think about their own spiritual issues and contemplate these things, and perhaps through my own story encourage people to think about God and how God's influence can be a real positive in your life, and encourage people to really start confronting some of these things in what is an increasingly secular society. Doesn't matter what age we live in, God is still there, despite what people may want to protest.
You've always been open about your faith, but you have written that your faith was shaken when you lost the election in 2022, and that your account, that you had a conversation with your maker, and it got pretty heated.
Yeah.
You say, why are you letting my enemies get the better of me? And that's, what you're inquiring after your election defeat. What answer did you get?
Well, I wouldn't say my faith was shaken. The thing about faith is, it's a bit like Job. If you read the book of Job, I mean, Job had some pretty tough conversations with God too, but his faith always remained. See, if you're not talking to God, then your faith is gone. And the first place I went in that time was to him, and to open my heart out to him, and to expose myself in that way. And the encouragement I got through my faith is that he's there with me in the best of times and the most difficult of times. And in the book, Plans for Your Good, I recount just so many occasions where I've known that to be true, whether personally with Jenny and I, when it took us over 14 years for us to realise the great miracle of the birth of our first child, Abby, and then a second child in Lily. This was just an extraordinary blessing. And, God has just always been the constant in my life. And so even in the most difficult of times, I've found his presence calming, encouraging, strengthening, enabled me to look forward with hope, which is really what the book's trying to say. The thing about my faith is that it's not a vending machine. Pray, expect to get something. That's not how it works. I find the joy in his presence, whether that's in suffering or in great achievement.
And speaking of suffering, at the moment, we know that so many women in Australia are suffering. Violence against women is at a crisis point.
True.
Do you regret not showing more support for women when you were PM, especially when it came to your decision not to attend marches for women?
Well, as you have seen most recently, I was the subject of what was a rather vicious campaign, which was found to be based on a complete lie. There was a lot of politics around that. I dealt with that issue in absolutely good faith. And when it comes to our policy commitments, we had the record of investment in these issues and sought to do so in a bipartisan way and not weaponise those issues or politicise those issues. And sadly, our government, and me in particular, were the target of what was a very, I think, a disappointing campaign. This wasn't an issue that should have been used for politics. And sadly, I think it was, as the recent court case has found.
Beyond that court case, the issue more broadly, it is a case for politics, violence against women and curbing it. Do you feel you could and should have done more?
I did everything I believe I possibly could have, and that's my honest answer. I mean, the investments, when I started off as Treasurer, we inherited a budget in terms of the national plan for stopping violence against women and children. With no money in it, really. And we upped that immediately to 100 million, and then billions in my last budget were committed. And not just when it came to addressing issues of domestic violence, but dealing with the many significant and serious health issues that women face, endometriosis and things of that nature, and the support we gave into those issues. Our mental health initiatives also had a strong focus on women as well. And I was greatly assisted with tremendous advisors out of the mental health sector and in the domestic violence area as well. When I say it shouldn't be politicised, it's certainly a matter of politics. There's no doubt about that. But I was disappointed that the issue was weaponised for partisan purposes and weaponised for political purposes. And I think now, several years after the event, I think people have been able to see that. And as I said, the courts have found it objectively.
While your book is obviously about faith and very personal, you do interweave politics in parts, and you talk pretty candidly about COVID-19 and how hard it was to be a leader in that time. But there are some pretty obvious omissions in the book. Your role as architect of Operation Sovereign Borders, robo-debt, the ministries you swore yourself into. If you want people to go on a faith journey with you, isn't honesty and transparency important?
Well, I've addressed all of those issues in other forums and at some length, and they're issues that the media have spent a lot of time on. And this book is not a political...
But you haven't...
Well, I have actually.
But you haven't spent as much time on it.
No, I have actually. I gave a number of addresses in the Parliament, which I think was the right forum to do that. I've appeared before many retrospective interviews, whether it's on the ABC, Sky or many other places, and I've addressed those matters on numerous occasions, held press conferences, and I believe I've addressed those matters. What this book is not a political treatise. It's not about providing either a defence or a promotion of my time in government. It's not about what I did. It's about what I believe God has done for me and how faith assisted me in a time of leadership when Australia was going through a great national crisis. And so I understand people are focused on some of those issues, but I've given my explanation of those. And in this book, I'm trying to address the core focus of what my life has always been about, and that has been the driving influence of my faith.
And to give credit where it's due, your book has an astonishing and a pretty, I would say, admirable lack of vindictiveness. There seems to be almost no score settling.
Well, no, there's not.
Was that intentional?
Of course. Politics is a tough, robust and often malevolent and brutal business. But, I leave politics without bitterness. I leave politics with forgiveness. I leave politics not wanting to hold on to score settling. I've seen this destroy people's lives, both while they've been in politics and afterwards. And my faith teaches me that's not how you live your life. Yes, things happened to me. There are things that I found very difficult when I was there. Not every decision was right. Name me a Prime Minister who can say that they have got everything right, particularly at a time of national stress and challenge that I was facing. But, you move on with your life, and that's what faith has always done for me. I don't define myself by the roles I've performed. I define my identity by who I believe I am in Jesus Christ and made in God's image by his hand for his glory. That's what this book is really trying to celebrate and encourage people to look at life through that perspective. When we understand that we're special and unique and valuable as human beings in God's sight, well, that changes your whole outlook. That makes you understand that you're just not the collection of physical attributes you have or your past or any of these things, but you are special and valued and loved and created. And this makes every human being incredibly important.
So if you're not a believer but you're curious to learn more about your journey with your faith, what Christian values would you like people to take away from reading this book?
Well, I think the one I've just outlined, most importantly. I mean, someone's already described this book as my love letter to God. And I think that's actually a pretty good explanation of it. It is about me explaining that relationship I've had with God. And Christianity is about a relationship. And it's about how God can encourage and strengthen you and form you and give you that sense of peace and confidence about who you are and the hope that you have in him. And it enables you to go through all of life's circumstances, no matter what they come to. But the great challenge for all Christians is to show that same love that's been shown to us to others. And that work continues whether you're in politics, whether you're out of politics, whatever role you're in.
So, repenting and seeking forgiveness is obviously crucial to Christianity. What specific actions and policies as Prime Minister have you repented for?
Well, they're things between me and God.
You're not willing to share any of them?
Well, you don't look like Oprah and I don't look like I'm on a couch. So it's not something that's not what this book is about. I talk about, my own road of, coming to terms with things. And we all have regrets in life. But the thing about it is you don't let them hold you back. You come to terms with them, you move on. Where those who have wronged you, you forgive, you move on.
You may move on, but those affected may not move on and may be heartened to hear that you've reflected and taken ownership of your behaviour.
Well, what are you referring to?
Oh, I mean, there are many different things. One, for example, any regrets or apologies or repenting for Michael Tauck, who was, running against you in the Cook by-election. There were suggestions that
no, because I didn't do anything to Michael Tauck.
So you didn't. You maintain that you didn't do anything to use his ethnicity as a Lebanese person or a campaign suggesting that he was Muslim.
No, I've rejected that absolutely on every occasion it's ever been put to me because it's untrue.
Okay, what about going to Hawaii during the bushfires? Did you?
I dealt with that the second I got off the plane when I came back to Australia after being there for a few days. I mean, I've dealt with these things.
You may have dealt with them publicly. Have you dealt with them spiritually?
Of course.
They are things you've sought forgiveness for?
Well, I said that in front of the whole country at the time.
Who do you think your reader is for this book? Because it's published under a specifically Christian import. So the book does seem designed to perhaps ingratiate yourselves with a conservative evangelical fellow travellers in the United States. Is this book for an overseas reader, particularly in some of the way you detail certain language like pylons and in parts reads as though the audience isn't necessarily Australian?
Well, it's both. And, for the sake of an overseas readership, there are things about Australia you need to explain. And I've done that, but I think it's for audiences in predominantly Western countries. I was up in Korea recently and there was some interest up there as well as there was in Japan. I mean, in the book I talk a fair bit about my relationship with the late Shinzo Abe and matters that deal with the Indo-Pacific. But those, I think, who have a share of faith, I hope, will find it of great encouragement. But those who don't have one, I hope it's a witness as to what my faith is and that that may interest them and explain or rather address some questions that they have about people of faith. And I hope that's the case. But the way you characterised it earlier, it seemed to be coming through a very political lens. This is not a political book. I'm not trying to ingratiate myself with anyone. I'm just trying to be honest about who I am and what my faith is and what my lessons have been and trying to encourage people about them.
I did wonder while I was reading it, while learning many things, but I wondered if this book was almost a long CV to help score your next gig in the United States.
Why would you suggest that?
Oh, only because it felt very much like it was written for a United States. They have quite a flourishing evangelical community over there in both defence and the private sector, and I did wonder if that subconsciously was part of it.
No, I think, look, to be honest, I think that's a bit cynical.
Okay,
it's just an honest expression of my faith, and maybe that is challenging. Maybe that is raising questions that people have. Well, good. I think it's good to talk about faith. I think it's good to talk about spiritual things. Sometimes we can overthink these things. It is what it is. It's my confession of my faith in a very honest way. There's no other agendas. That's it.
What did you learn most about writing a book? Because, I've written a book. It's challenging. You can be good at other things. And then when it comes down to writing a book, there are all these sorts of hurdles and things you don't expect until you sit down to write. What was one challenge that you faced? Or was it pretty seamless?
Look, no, I think the writing process I enjoyed quite a lot. I found it quite cathartic, to be honest, to reflect on many things and connect the dots over different parts of my life. Reflections on from a very young age through to more recent times. And it was very encouraging to sort of connect the dots and see that thread of God's faithfulness over the course of my life. I found that of itself very rewarding. And so I hope that is some of what I portray in the work, that people can hopefully start asking questions about how they perhaps may have seen God's influence in their own life and maybe connect some of those dots. I mean, we live in a very secular society these days. Australia is not the Australia I grew up in. I suspect it's not the Australia you grew up in either. You're much younger than me. But even in a short period of time, I think we've seen a lot of Western society start to disconnect from those sort of Judeo-Christian foundations which our Western and modern democracies are based on. Now, not everyone has to be a Christian to get that, but it's true. And I said this in my final speech in the Parliament. I think if we lose our connection with that, then what are we connected to? How do we hold on to these fundamental principles that are fundamentally divinely inspired? That is what has given, I think, our Western democracies and societies the advantage for liberty that we've always enjoyed, and I want to see that continue. No, I'm not. People's faith is their own business, and freedom of religion, I think, is a really important fundamental principle of our societies. But I do get worried about what I see as a form of tyranny, which is coming in secularism, which is seeking to shut religious and Christian conversation out. I mean, people have always felt quite challenged by the fact I've talked about my faith. They think it's an interference with the separation of church and state. Well, it's freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. And separation of church and state was designed, frankly, to protect the church when it was first introduced.
Yeah. A form of tyranny, how? You use those words.
Cancelling of Christians, cancelling of Christian morality, seeking to dismiss those views completely from the public space. I faced it myself when I was in politics. I'll never forget.
Where do we see that? So I'm just going to jump in here. Where do we see the cancelling of Christians?
I was regularly mocked.
Mocking's one thing, cancellation's another.
Oh, if you don't think cancel culture applies when it comes to people of Christian faith in this country, you need to look a lot closer, because Christians certainly understand it and we experience it.
I'm not suggesting it's not. I'm just trying to understand where this has happened. Often when we talk about cancel culture, a lot of it is, rhetoric and hypotheticals and very few actual examples.
Well, look, if it needs convincing, then I don't think you're picking up on what's going on out there, would be my view.
I would just like an example, that's all, of where someone who you believe was cancelled because of their Christianity.
Well, I think to a large extent I was, frankly.
You lost the democratic election.
Because of my faith by many people, and I became the focus of derision and attacks because of my faith for many people.
But Anthony Albanese is a practising Catholic.
Good for him.
Well, then I would just contest that you were cancelled for your faith.
No, I think it's pretty fair to say that there are elements of the media and my opponents who were very critical and used to zero on pretty regularly on my faith. In fact, it came up in the 2019 election where that became an issue. I remember, I was mocked because I went to my own church on Easter Sunday and there were cameras in the church. There were cameras in the church on Good Friday at the Maronite Church, but that didn't seem to be something that troubled people. There was an essence of, well, if you go to an evangelical church, there must be something wrong with you. Maybe you're pitching for a job in the United States. No, it's, I think, a lack of understanding about these things. And I think in a free society, there needs to be greater tolerance of people's different religious views and their own Christianity and how you practice that. And increasingly, sadly, I think we're seeing less of that.
I would agree that there was quite a bit of interest in your connection to the Pentecostal church and your Pentecostal faith. Do you wonder, though, if some of that move away from faith-based institutions and more secularism is because some of those faiths, Judeo-Christian values, excluded and weren't inviting to minorities, whether they be ethnic minorities or people from the queer community or even for women? Do you think that's a response, in seeking to ask for inclusion and acceptance for Christianity, which I absolutely support, that the pushback is a response to those who felt excluded from faith? Well,
in the book, I talk in particular about some of the terrible things that have happened in the institutional church, and the Royal Commission being a very significant one of those. And I talk particularly to Christians of the need for us to deal with these things. And I do think there's been a contribution to the, if you like, the diminution in people's trust in those institutions. But the point I'm trying to make is they're human institutions. Jesus is still Jesus. Faith is still faith. And it exists outside denominations and buildings and man-made institutions. I believe Christianity is the most inclusive religion in the world. And you've only got to see its rapid growth outside of Western cultures. The rapid growth of the church in China, in Iran, in Africa, and all of these places. I mean, it is the most inclusive religion where everybody is welcome. Absolutely everybody. Now, the Bible says what the Bible says. That's God's standard. But everybody is welcome to walk into any church, anywhere, into any place of Christian faith, I believe, anywhere in the country and anywhere in the world.
And so what do you make, though, while, yes, it is increasing rapidly in China and in some developing countries, it's decreasing in Western democracies?
Yes, in many areas, I think that's true. And I also cover that off when looking at the official numbers. I mean, nominally, Australia is no longer a Christian nation. Less than half the country associates themselves nominally. But to be honest, I think those who have a strong faith have seen that, there's a difference between nominally being a Christian and one who's, practicing and involved with it every day. And I think that's been in the minority for some time. There's no doubt that Western society has come to think of itself as disconnected from these questions and no longer puts that at the centre of its society. I think that's true. But that, I think, only says that Christians and those who are practicing their faith need to continue to live it and practice it and confess it and not compromise it. And like any minority culture in a Western society, it should be respected. What I always found as Prime Minister was that those who most passionately supported religious freedom were not just people who held the Christian faith, but those who held any faith. And I found a lot of solidarity with people of so many different faiths and really enjoyed the time I spent with them. And there was a wonderful interfaith dialogue, which I'm pleased to still be involved with.
Is it perhaps for the first time, as you mentioned, Christianity is no longer the dominant religion in Australia? Is it difficult perhaps for someone of your background and standing for the first time in your life to be part of a growing minority or a shrinking minority? It'd be an unfamiliar feeling.
Well, I think things have changed. It doesn't change my faith. It doesn't change how I feel about it. It doesn't change my commitment to it.
Might make you uncomfortable, though.
Well, I think this is going to be the lot of Christians increasingly in Western society. And I talk about that in the book too. That, so as a Christian today, in a Western country, in a Western society, who are we, how do we live, and what do we hope for? These are the questions that I raise. And this is why in the book I talk a lot about Daniel, who was in a very similar situation in Nebuchadnezzar's court. He was a prime minister. I would often read the sections of Daniel. I found great encouragement when I was prime minister. He was a prime minister of sorts himself, as was Joseph. So I think there are a lot of lessons there for us about how we do that. And there's been, I think, a lot of great works recently which address this question. And, we're still called to be the light. We're still called to live out our faith in whatever environment it happens to be. But the church is alive, Christian faith is alive, and it's vibrant. And I'm pleased to be parts of a community that's how we rejoice.
You suggested I was a little bit cynical in putting forward.
I don't think it was unfair.
No, in putting forward that you had your eyes on a job in the United States. If not, then what's next for Mr. Scott Morrison?
Well, I'm already doing it. And look, I don't think I'm really planning a career in publishing. I mean, I've enjoyed doing this, and I thought it was, not a bad habit, and I hope it will be encouraging to people. But these days, I work in advisory roles around the world. I sit on some global advisory boards in a range of different sectors in finance and funds management and defence industry and infrastructure and remain pretty connected up through the region. I travel quite a bit. I continue to meet with senior leaders around the world and stay in touch with the things they're wrestling with. And I continue to highlight the very real security risks of what we live here in the Indo-Pacific and encourage greater integration of the corporate sector, the government sector in having a strong resilience to what is the hegemonic ambitions of the PRC in our region, which poses the greatest threat to global stability that we've seen since the Second World War.
Okay, so that's a really long way of saying I'm doing what I'm doing and I'm not telling you what I'm doing next.
Well, I'm doing it. I'm a global advisor on boards and in my own firm and with a firm called American Global Strategies in the United States, where I worked with the former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. I sit on some boards with Mike Pompeo, and I'm enjoying that work. It's different to obviously when you're in government, but that my many years in government have taught me many lessons that I think can help in the advisory roles that I now have.
Wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the book?
No, look, here it is, and I hope people enjoy it. You can get it pretty much wherever you can buy books these days, and I'd encourage people, if any of this has sparked your interest or you've got more questions, I hope it's addressed in the book, and I appreciate the opportunity for us to have a good discussion about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thanks a lot, Antoinette.
Scott Morrison, former Prime Minister, author of Plans for Your Good, a Prime Minister's testimony of God's faithfulness, and, of course, lover of a chicken curry, chicken not necessarily cooked through. So Helen Smith joins me now. We'd usually do the weekend list, but Helen, you still look a little bit shell-shocked by that chat.
Yeah, I was firstly very impressed with you and your interviewing of ScoMo. You did a really good job.
Aww.
And I was standing in the studio.
Don't stop it. Just keep going.
I know you love a compliment. But I was standing in the studio producing it with you, and I was inside the studio, so I had to be quiet.
Yeah.
And wow, that was hard because my jaw was just dropped. And I just think you were asking the questions that I was like, oh my God, yes, I'm so glad you asked that. The one about repenting his sins when anything he repented when he was Prime Minister. I was like, yeah, was there anything? Because you did a lot of things that a lot of people didn't agree with, didn't like.
And a lot of people were harmed by.
Yeah.
Look, to be fair, it was really difficult when you approached me and said, ScoMo's going to come on the podcast to talk about his book, because I had mixed feelings about how much do you want to platform and promote somebody who has been incredibly damaging both to the Liberal Party and to Australians. But he is, of course, a former Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity to ask questions, but also ask questions when there's not much he can do about it. He's not in power anymore. In many ways, the damage is done, the legacy has been left. So I was really torn about, how much to allow space for his faith, because I do respect people who have strong faith. And I say that with the caveat that provided their faith means that they make space for people not like them.
Yes.
And they are guided by their faith in treating all people well. So I was a bit, a little conflicted about how to best manage that.
And I think you did. I think you did manage it, and you brought it up a few times about him now almost being a minority in the Christian faith in Australia, which I loved because I was like, how he treated minorities when he was in the government.
Yes.
Just kind of playing on that angle, which I thought was really interesting, and his reaction from that. But no, I think it was a really well done chat that, I got where you were coming from, but I thought, no, Antoinette.
Yeah, no, you pushed me.
This.
You were like, no, let's do this.
We've got to do this.
What I did learn and what I did appreciate is that the book is not malicious in that it, unlike other prime ministers who've either written books or done plenty of interviews subsequent to them being in office or after they're in office, where there are personal vendettas, where there is name calling. And it was refreshing, and I give Scott Morrison credit for that, the book didn't feel revengeful at all.
No.
It felt honest and it felt vulnerable. But I have a question for you. Will you, off the back of that, are you interested to read the book and to learn? Do you want to know Scott Morrison's plans for your good?
Look, I grew up in a very religious Christian household with my nanny as a pastor, and I've had my days. Okay. I've had my days wrapped in religion, and you know what? I did read some of it, obviously for research.
Yes.
But I've done the religion thing, man.
Yeah, okay.
Next.
Yeah, not for you.
Not
okay,
for
but
me.
I would love to hear from you, our wonderful listeners. Are you interested to read the book? Do you want to know what Scott Morrison's plans for your good are? He has written this book, A Prime Minister's Testimony of God's Faithfulness. Is it important that we try and learn about people's relationships with faith, even if it's different to ours? I'll leave that with you, but we would love to hear your comments, your thoughts on the interview with Scott Morrison. But that is it for this week. Thank you so much for being with us and tuning in. It is always a pleasure. If you want more of the Weekend Briefing, find us on the Listener app, or you can follow us wherever you subscribe and get your podcasts from. And please do, as I said, give us a rating and review for this interview. We'll be back on Monday morning where the team will have the latest headlines straight to your headphones along with some interesting interviews. Stay safe, everyone. Chat to you next week.
Listener.